Hi, and welcome back to Working Class History Podcast. We've got something a bit different for you today because I recently sat down with our friends at the Coffee with Comrades podcast to chat about our new book, Working Class History, Everyday Acts of Resistance and Rebellion, which is available now in our online store at shop.workingclasshistory.com and link in the show notes. So after the theme music, what follows is their interview with me, which they then edited into an episode of their podcast. And they kindly shared the audio with us to release as an episode as well. So if you enjoy it, make sure to check out the Coffee with Comrades podcast and subscribe. Enjoy.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina. Alzata, il risaia mi tocca andare.
John, welcome on Coffee with Comrades, buddy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely, bud. Well, can you tell listeners who may not be aware a little bit about working class history? Like, what was the genesis of the project? How did it come into being? And where are y'all at now?
In general terms, we're like a collective of people who are basically dedicated to researching and promoting people's history, the history of social movements and struggles, with the intention of helping kind of educate and inspire our organising efforts and our struggles today. We got started in basically posting on this day in history anniversaries on social media because we thought that might be a good way of helping kind of radical history go a bit viral because people kind of like anniversaries.
Yeah.
Like they're totally arbitrary, but...
We've passed this arbitrary point around the sun. Yippee!
No, exactly. But at the same time, they do kind of draw a connection with the present that might not otherwise be there, you know, that this random thing happened like 250 years ago or whatever, but it was a day kind of like today. So that was sort of how we started, just doing social media posts, and that was kind of more viral than we anticipated. Yeah, it worked out being a lot more popular than we thought. So we started developing in other areas, and the main thing being that we started a podcast a couple of years ago to kind of look into these stories in more detail and like capture people's experiences, people that took part in these movements wherever possible, and obviously sometimes historians for stuff that's where there are no longer participants around, to get into everything a bit more detail.
That's awesome.
And now we've just published our first book, Working Class History, Everyday Acts of Resistance and Rebellion, as a way of putting something more into the real world in a real kind of physical thing, you know, stuff. Remember when there used to be stuff?
It's definitely different, having it just be like a post online versus it being like a book that's sitting on your shelf or, a podcast in your ears. And so it's cool to hear about like how the project has developed from, being viral, like social media posts into a podcast, delving into more depth into the book. And we're going to talk about the book here in just a little bit, and I'm really excited about it. But before we get there, I did want to first ask you just about how, like, you've got into radical politics yourself, John, because it's a question I find endlessly fascinating, and I love asking guests about it when they come on the show because everybody has like a kind of a little bit of a different story. And so I'm curious, like, how did you kind of get onboarded to radical politics?
I think it was a long process, and I think it's hard to tell kind of when it started exactly. I come from a pretty apolitical family. There wasn't really talk about politics in the home, and I didn't ever really sort of think about it. As a kid, there were some things that I learned about that made me think there's something seriously wrong, particularly stuff to do with the destruction of the environment, climate change, and the burning of fossil fuels and all that sort of thing. And then I remember one particular kind of article that I read in the news as a kid was about there'd been a coffee glut. People had grown too much coffee, like coffee growers had been too kind of effective. So that meant that the price of coffee had gone down too much. So they put like millions of tons of coffee in a big pile and burned it all.
Jesus.
And then it was like, so now it's great. So now the price of coffee's kind of gone back up again. And I just kind of thought that like, that's obviously doesn't make any rational sense. And like just little things like that. Like I remember being in like geography class where we learned about European like food mountains and stuff, how there was, you know, just all these mountains of additional food that was being grown but it wasn't being eaten, essentially because too much was being way more, like, you know, like now way more is made than is eaten. And, you know, I was a kid or whatever, so I put my hand up, and because we'd also obviously learned about, you know, famines in these places and so many people being malnourished around the world and everything. So I remember putting my hand up and asking, like, well, if we have all this extra food and there's a whole load of people that don't have enough food, why don't we share the food with those people? And then the teacher was just like, you know, that would destroy the economy, putting a bunch of free food and, you know, giving them. And so I was like,
it's okay for people to starve, because if they don't, then we're going to crash the economy.
Exactly. So, you know, and so as a kid with all this sort of, you know, environmental destruction setting us on course for like catastrophe, you know, I just kind of thought, well, the world is stupid, you know, essentially. So I'll just go and live my life and whatever. But then I think reading about stuff like about the criminal justice system, about mental health, it ended up meeting a group of socialists doing like a street store thing, and they sold a magazine. So I was like, oh, you know, I'll have a look at that. And the magazine was just filled with, it kept talking about neoliberalism. And like, I had no fucking clue I didn't know what neoliberalism was. And it didn't explain it anywhere. I mean, I got the idea that it was bad, but, you know, I didn't really know what it was. So I kind of put that to one side. But then I started going to some demonstrations about different things against the Israeli occupation of Palestine and things like that, and picking up leaflets and then just reading and I took things from there, really. So I think that's kind of where I encountered kind of radical ideas and then started to think, well, actually, this actually makes sense. And this ties in with the stuff that I thought already, that it's actually capitalism is the reason that we're destroying the planet. It's not because everything's stupid or whatever. It's because, no, like certain people are making huge amounts of money. People are making profits from use of fossil fuels, and things like food and are grown for profit, not for human need. And that's the cause of these problems, and that's how we can change them. So I think that's kind of where it came from. Although, like, I know I've gone on for quite a bit now, but I think, you know, I think that's where I got into kind of radical politics from an ideological perspective. Yeah, one thing I kind of forgot to mention was that, which is I think really important, was that it was the time of what was called like the anti-capitalist movement. So early 2000s, either the anti-capitalist movement or anti-globalization movement was all over the news. So that was something which I think helped radicalize a large number of people kind of getting into that around that period of time, and the kind of the Iraq War as well.
I was going to ask, did you go to any of the anti-war protests like during that period?
Yeah, that was my first. I mean, apart from the anti-capitalist movement as such, which was it a social movement or was it not? It was more kind of a series of big demonstrations rather than like a real kind of movement. So the movement against the Iraq War was my first experience with a real kind of mass social movement, and I think that helped learn a lot of lessons, especially in terms of what doesn't work, you know, what doesn't achieve anything.
Right.
Because obviously, you know, as part of that movement, there was like in the UK, where I was, there was the biggest demonstration ever of 1.5 million people, but it was just completely ignored by the powers that be, because we didn't threaten anything. We didn't disrupt anything. We just sort of peacefully marched in a circle and waved some placards around and were like, please don't do this. And then they did. And then everyone kind of went home. And some people, you know, tried voting for different parties, which didn't change what happened either. So I think it was a good set of lessons on what type of social movement doesn't achieve anything, and then did some more reading and learning about social movements that do achieve things.
Yeah, it's always interesting too, thinking about like some of those early moments where you like look back retroactively and you're like, man, like if I had known then what I know now, what would I have done differently? And I like, it's always interesting kind of like looking back in retrospect and thinking through some of those like larger demonstrations or movements, or as you put it, like maybe not a totally a social movement, but like with the anti-globalization protests, but like a series of protests, and thinking about like how they could have been more effective. And like I think it's really easy to get caught in that, like, you know, that mindset of like the rose-colored glasses where you look back and you're like, man, I could have done this differently. But I think that like one of the things that is really urgent is to, instead of just looking back and thinking like what could be different, taking those like that critical lens and then pushing it to what we're dealing with now, and sort of saying, okay, so these are the lessons that I've learned. Now, how can I actually begin to act upon them in a way that makes sense? And I think that, y'all's project as a whole really is all about that, right? And I really loved what you said earlier, John, about the idea, right, of working class history not just being something that is in the past, but kind of giving it a concrete connection that tethers it to the today, right? On this day in history, right? And I think that really kind of resonates with this overall project that y'all have been working on now for over half a decade. And I wanted to turn now to talking about the book itself, but in order to get like a good idea of what working class history is as a book, right? Since it's distinct in many ways from the viral media posts, and it's distinct from the podcast, I thought I'd first have you read the passage for today. And we're recording today on December the 12th. And so I was wondering if you'd be so good as to read that passage to our listeners. I'm gonna flip over to it myself.
Sure. Unfortunately, the December the 12th is a bit of a depressing day.
It is. I realized that as soon as I wrote down this question for you, but I was like, well, it still serves the purpose.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like is it worth pretending it's a different day, or but I appreciate your commitment to kind of on it. So, and we're going to talk about stuff that's depressing or bad or whatever. So yeah, apologies. It's
bleak, y'all. Buckle in.
Yeah. So on the 12th of December, 1948, the Batang Kali massacre took place in Malaya, now Malaysia, with British troops massacring 24 unarmed villagers as part of a campaign against the communist insurgery in the British imperial colony. None of the murderers were charged with any offences. And 21 years later, on the 12th of December 1969, after months of workers and student strikes, a bomb exploded at a bank in central Milan, killing 16 people and wounding 88. It was initially blamed on the extra-parliamentary left, and it led to numerous arrests and the police murder of an anarchist rail worker named Giuseppe Pinelli. It was later discovered that the bombing had been carried out by the far right in concert with the state as part of what would become known as the Strategy of Tension, a counterinsurgency campaign, and 3 fascists were eventually jailed for the attack in 2001.
Again, I know that these two things are really bleak, but and I want to talk about that here in just a little bit, because rest assured, dear listener, that the book is not just filled with macabre, sad, despairing history. But before we get there, John, walk us through the book, right? How did y'all decide to format and approach the monumental task of trying to catalog people's history in a single tome?
Yeah, well, I think first, a bit of a disclaimer that we make no pretense at trying to catalogue or give a full account of people's history through history. We've got an archive of historical events that we've written up over time. This archive has a few thousand stories in it. And so this book is a curated selection of stories from that archive. We chose 2 from each day of the year. Now, our archive isn't comprehensive. It's just got the stuff in that we have found out about or that we've read about and that then we've kind of written up. And because of that, the type of content it is, there's a bias in it, principally about the kind of sources that we have access to and the sources that we've seen. They're biased towards the topics that people have written about in ways that we can access. So primarily, these are things like language. So stuff that's written in English or French, Italian, and Spanish, which are the languages that, between us we can read. So it's disproportionately about either those countries or former colonies of those countries. Also, in almost all historical sources, they are biased towards the history of straight white men. And we've endeavored to rectify that as much as possible and make the book as diverse as possible in terms of geography, in terms of the countries, in terms of the types of people, in terms of gender, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, gender identity, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it is an arbitrary selection of just what we happen to think are the most interesting on a given day. I think we are not trying to be comprehensive or tell the whole story of everything, which would be beyond the scope of a single tome, I believe. And in terms of the idea for this specific book, it being a curated selection of our archive, it basically came from our publishers, PM Press, who are an independent radical publisher based in the UK and US, who publish a lot of other great titles. And they saw our social media accounts and they contacted us and suggested compiling, some of our stuff into a book. So this is very much the product of PM Press contacting us and making that happen. So yeah, we are grateful to them for that.
I think that's like what's kind of interesting, right, about working class history as a book is that it's doing something very specific that y'all have done, for the entire duration that working class history has been a thing, and it's just now put into a book, which I think is a particular medium and affords readers a particular tool that they can use to educate one another or to educate themselves. And you mentioned kind of like how you guys started to select things, because each kind of day from history only has 2 different snippets from history. And you talked a little bit just a moment ago about how you were intentional about trying to get a diverse cast of characters throughout history, and give their stories throughout the text. But was it ever challenging for y'all to determine like which 2 segments should be included on a given day? And if so, like maybe like one of the stories or one of the days that you guys particularly had to like scratch your heads over and kind of like, argue or like say, this is the one that has to be in here and here's all the reasons why.
Yes, it was definitely very difficult to kind of narrow it down, because picking stuff by the date it happened is an arbitrary way of picking stuff. We haven't picked the most important stuff. There's a lot of super important events that aren't in the book at all. And I think we've often tended to choose stuff that was maybe less well known. But yeah, the primary justification for choosing one thing or another was just generally to keep the content interesting and different and make it as representative as possible of different geographical areas and groups. So it was very difficult to leave some things out. In terms of any specific dates, if you give me a second, I can have a quick look.
Do you guys have like for the archive? Do you guys have like a sort of like a shared Google? Like how do you do it? Like what does the repository look like for y'all?
At the moment, it is a Google spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. A very large, very large Google spreadsheet. But longer term, our intention is to turn the whole archive into a big kind of website with browsable timelines and maps of everything that's in it, so that people will be able to look at it on their smartphones and view stuff that happened near them and everything.
That's so fucking cool.
I think when it's done, it will be really. It's been really fun, like doing the actual mapping, because we've managed to find out some really specific, exact spots where things happened. One that I found the other day that was quite fun was I don't know if you know about it, but the Metropolitan Police in London was the first police force, the first kind of modern police force in the world, and they were deeply unpopular in London, particularly in working class communities. And in the first couple of years of them existing, one of their officers was murdered by a member of the public, a bloke in London in King's Cross. And the jury determined that it was that the murder of the police officer was justifiable homicide, and that the officer had contributed to his own death, in paraphrasing, by being a dick. And they determined that even though the coroner locked the jury in the room to get them to change their verdict, they didn't. That's just one example of how, nowadays the police are everywhere and people kind of think that they're natural and people think that they're there to protect us. But when they were actually first introduced, nobody had that opinion of them. They were there to, in places like the UK and Western Europe, they were there to police working class people, to police their lives, and also in particular to police and break up their demonstrations without killing them. So to beat them up rather than murdering them, which had the tendency to make more people angry, right. To just beat them up with sticks and then hope that they go away. Obviously in the US, a slightly different history. There was that side of things in the north, and then in the south they emerged from slave patrols, groups that would terrorize and harass Black Americans and catch escaped enslaved people. And but that's just a small example. And anyway, with the map, so just found the exact spot where that happened, looking at some of the original paper, which is now in King's Cross Station in London by a sandwich shop and the concourse. But there we are.
So cool.
just sorry, that was a little aside. I was supposed to be trying to find stuff. I mean, I've got kind of one example here. On May the 21st, a lot of interesting stuff happened on the 21st of May. So on that day, we had suffragettes in Scotland fighting for women's right to vote, planted a bomb at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh. So a bomb exploded at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, and the suffragettes left a note there indicating that they're responsible. And at the same day, there was also a strike of workers at the port in Falmouth, Jamaica. There was a strike against the Nazis, against Nazi occupation by actors in Norway. In 1945, the US government took over bituminous coal mines to try and break a miners' strike. In 1979, there were the White Night riots in San Francisco, when LGBT plus people, furious at the murder of Harvey Milk, one of the first openly gay elected officials in the US, his murderer wasn't convicted of murder, despite the fact that he's clearly a murderer. And so there was a riot there in San Francisco. Things like, so yeah, just one day, like a whole bunch of, there's some other stuff there too.
Yeah, I can only imagine how fucking daunting that must have been to just be like, okay, so we can only choose two. Can we just change it to, can we have three this day? Like, I can definitely see how, like, it's an interesting kind of, like, framing of history, of looking at days and specific events rather than narratives, right? Because so much of history, especially that you read in books, right, is a narrative. And in this text specifically does something different, which I think is really intriguing. And I wanted to kind of ask you about it, because, like, when I first got the text, I immediately started, like, thumbing through it and looking at the different dates. I looked at my birthday, and it struck me that this is, like, a really excellent tool for homeschooling, because my partner homeschools her kids, and we've sort of made it a ritual to start, like, reading the two passages from Working Class History aloud to them each morning at breakfast, which has been really awesome. So I want to first of all say thanks for that, but I also wanted to ask you broadly, right, about what sort of applications y'all see this text serving as an educational tool, specifically because, right, it is doing something really unique and different from a lot of other historical texts that you might find in your local library or sitting on the shelf of your local bookstore.
First off, that's so cool that you know, you found it useful to use in that, right? Yeah, it really means a lot that it's been helpful in your, you know, life like that. You know, that's amazing. I kind of think that a way it's useful is that the teaching by educational establishments at school level of anything to do with social movements, resistance, the crimes of colonialism and capitalism and that sort of thing is pretty appalling. Certainly in some areas, things have got better in some parts of the US. Some parts like that are being taught at a school level. But again, it's generally pretty specific, and it's more about a US kind of setting. And so I think this book could be helpful to a lot of people simply because its breadth is very wide. There's a smattering of everything. Loads of different kinds of social movements in loads of different countries. And in the back, there's kind of sources and references that people can go to, obviously verified information that we've put there, and also to start finding out more. And so we hope that people then will take them as a jumping off point, basically, to explore other types of movements and things in certain parts of the world. And also, I think, to explore different questions about our world and our society, where we came from and where we're going. And so I think it's kind of useful from that perspective as well. Like, you know, and some things that we've put in there, we just put in, you know, one story about one thing on a day, but we hope that it raises questions, raises issues that are bigger than that, like the existence of the weekend and things like that, things which just seem relatively natural. Most people still, you know, Monday to Friday is work time, and then Saturday and Sunday there's a weekend. Obviously, that's not anything which is natural. That's a socially created construct, and one which many people fought and died for. You know, the creation, because everyone used to have to work 7 days a week, 360 days a year plus, for 10, 14, 15, 16 hours a day. And it's struggles by people that came before us who have fought for a shorter working day, fought for a shorter working week, and things like that. And and that, you know, things that to some level we take for granted today. But and of course they're constantly under attack as well from employers now. It's also something which gives a glimpse into things about our world now which seem obvious that seem natural and obvious actually aren't natural or obvious at all. They were created and they were contested. People fought over these things and people were killed over them. There's almost nothing natural at all about human society. It's all stuff that we've made, including, you know, at the core of it, the fact that most of us have to work for a living for other people. That it seems like the most natural thing in the world. It's like, well, you wake up with the alarm clock and then you go to work or whatever to earn money and then buy stuff. That's not a natural state of affairs at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting thinking about like how the text invites people to become active in the learning process, right? Like it doesn't give you everything, right? It gives you this small, tiny snippet, and then it invites you to go learn more. And it's funny too, because I was looking through the book when I first got it, and I realized like a significant chunk of it, maybe like upwards of like a third of it, is like your sources. And like that's, first of all, impressive in and of itself. It makes sense because like the text is just like, here are these two different things that happen every single day, and you know, it makes sense that you'd have a long list of sources. But what's interesting about it, right, is that it does really give the reader the opportunity to either just like, you know, immerse themselves in a quick little snippet of history and just be like, oh, that's really interesting and that's cool, and they can just kind of like, you know, go about the rest of their day. Or it gives them the tools to go say, okay, here's the first step that you can take to begin investigating this and thinking through it and applying it, you know, the lessons from it to your own life or to your own struggle, or to your own community or whatever it might be. And so, you know, it's a really fascinating kind of approach that y'all have taken that I think is divergent in many ways. And in some ways it's sort of like a anathema in a certain sense, because it's like, you know, so much of history, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm by no means am I a history like scholar, but like my understanding is that like a lot of historical scholarship tends towards those narratives rather than focusing on specific dates, right? And looking at like larger stories that and struggles that contribute to major world events. And so it's really interesting that you guys take that different approach and do it in a way that doesn't just fixate on the date, but instead it really does invite people to investigate and learn and to grow and to think critically about these events. So yeah, I just wanted to commend y'all on that. It's a really interesting kind of approach to history telling.
Thanks. In terms of what you say about, you know, historical scholarship or whatever, you may be totally right. We're not people who are historical scholars by any means. Like I know personally, I haven't like got a degree or anything, let alone like a PhD or anything like that. And I actually, because in the UK you start choosing subjects, you start specializing quite early. And I dropped, history was like an optional subject, so I dropped it at the earliest age I could possibly drop it.
And here you are helping to contribute to a working class history co-op. Oh, yeah, it's so strange how life, what paths life leads us down.
No, exactly. Like I think I dropped it either at 12 or 14. I can't remember the age I could kind of drop it, but it was just, history in school was so tedious. The stuff that we learned about was very tedious and boring and didn't really seem to have anything to do with, but yeah, I think you may be right. I don't really know much about academia, but I know that, say, if people want to do like a PhD or something, it has to be something like one thing which is really detailed or whatever, and not something that someone's done before. So I mean, obviously that will kind of shape what comes out of it. So that wasn't really something that we have any connection with. And our main thing was we want to make learning about history kind of fun and interesting as possible, and like open to the widest possible audience, and make it seem immediately relevant and understandable to anyone regardless of the level of education in a second, and write in language which, you know, isn't patronizing but is straightforward and doesn't use kind of jargon words without explaining. You know, if you need to use, like, you know, it's not about talking down to people or whatever, but if you use like long words or specialist terms, people are happy to use, like, you know, complex words or whatever, but they have to know what they mean. So just any kind of acronyms or terms or whatever you use, just explain them the first time and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's our intention, and hopefully to some extent, at least, we've been successful in that to a point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You guys absolutely have. I wanted to ask you, and I might be asking you to spill a bit of the tea, because before we jumped on the mic, you mentioned some of the hurdles that it took to actually put the book together. But, initially y'all put this book up for pre-order on Kickstarter, and I'm pleased to say, like, as soon as I found out, I was like, hell yeah, like, I'm gonna immediately back this project. I'm a bit of a sucker for Kickstarter. I don't know how closely you follow Coffee with Comrades, John, but I love tabletop role-playing games and talk about them all the time, and like it's like a bevy, like there's like a hotbed of like games and stuff that pop up on Kickstarter. So I am a bit of a sucker for Kickstarter. But I'm curious because you guys have the book through PM Press, right? This publisher. And so I was kind of curious, what made you guys decide to take the approach of using Kickstarter after being approached by PM Press? And, how did that work out? What was the process like? What were some of the hurdles or pitfalls, the bureaucracy, the sort of trying to actually take the germination of this really awesome idea and turn it into this physical artifact that people can now carry around and put on their bookshelves and use to educate their kids?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for your support, for backing it and helping make it happen, and everyone else who did as well. It is massively appreciated. Basically, the Kickstarter is crowdfunding initial publication of books is what our publisher PM Press has started doing recently with most of its titles, where that would be appropriate, where it's kind of first editions of something. So that's a model that they have adopted, being a small independent radical publisher in the current climate, which is difficult in a lot of ways.
That's a massive understatement.
Yeah, and especially for things like print publishing and as an industry. So it's a model which they've adopted. I mean, just to be clear, I haven't, this hasn't been spelled out to me exactly by PM Press, but, my interpretation of it is it's essentially it mitigates any risk for them in publishing new works, because they ensure that they cover the cost of printing before they do, so that whatever happens, they won't make a loss by printing it, so they cover the initial printing cost.
Right.
It was their idea, and it's what they're doing with their new works. And I think, it's really fantastic as well, because it does mean that small publishers that don't have huge amounts of capital can get new works printed and can be more, can be a bit more daring in the kind of things that obviously PM Press has always published kind of daring stuff or whatever, but it is a way of essentially minimizing risk and meaning that you don't need large amounts of capital at the beginning, because you can open it up to people, and if enough people believe in it, then it can happen. It was really great, really, and seeing the amount of response it got was very surprising and heartwarming. But it did create logistical difficulties, because obviously it's just a large amount of communication from a large number of people,
right? And
that's something which is tricky to deal with in itself, just because it takes time to read emails and messages from people and reply to them. And so I think logistically that was the only issue, really, is just managing all the communication. And then obviously PM Press have done all of the shipping and fulfillment, the sending out everything, and that was a considerable piece of work as well. But that wasn't something that we at WCH had to worry about. But I know that people in the PM warehouses in the UK and US worked extremely long hours and still are packing orders and printing labels and putting them on and getting them out, and have just done an absolutely, if they worked for like a capitalist employer, you'd say that they should probably organise and do something about having to work the kind of hours that they have. They've really taken on the brunt of the most difficult stuff.
Well, right on. Well, shout out to PM Press for that. Just as an aside, have you heard about the podcast that catalogs Kickstarter's unionization efforts? The sort of oral history podcast that goes through their unionization effort?
Yeah, because I know you said if I heard about their unionization efforts, so I was going to mention the Oral History podcast that's been done and is really fantastic. We've been sharing that on Twitter, and hopefully we can pop a link to it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
For people, because it's a great thing to organize, but it's also really a big problem with, our history, our history of like, working people, working class people, is that a lot of our history isn't written down. This isn't written down, it's spoken and recorded. It isn't recorded. So it's really great that that's being done. So other workers can learn from sort of their experiences. And yeah, we had some contacts with current and former Kickstarter workers. For example, Clarissa Redwine, who has been doing the Oral History podcast. We got some nice messages from other Kickstarter workers so it was really fantastic that, that was going on, and they got union recognition while we were doing the Kickstarter campaign.
Obviously people should absolutely check it out because it's a really like well produced and like well cut together podcast. And I actually have some comrades who work for Kickstarter, and we're, I don't want to name names, but we're pretty crucial to the unionization effort. So shout out to them if they're listening to this edition of Coffee with Comrades or Working Class History. But I also wanted to,
yeah,
John,
definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. And Kickstarter also kindly kind of designated our book as a project we love. So obviously I don't know who at Kickstarter was responsible for that decision, but whoever the person or people it was, we're very grateful to that. So thank you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. John, I was struck by the fact that a lot of the working class history y'all include in this book is pretty fucking bleak. And we kind of mentioned this at the top of the episode, but like, I wanted to say I really do appreciate the fact that alongside victories and successful struggles, y'all also chose to include the heartbreak and the setback. And I was curious, was this like an intentional, like active choice that you made with the book? Or was it something that was simply kind of a byproduct of the very real history of working class people and the trauma and turmoil that we have endured in order to make the world suck a little bit less?
Firstly, kind of want to apologize for that in a way, because it would be great to just be inspiring and uplifting, and unfortunately that's just not how everything always is. I think one day we definitely want to do a book which is just good news, but that's not this one, because this is kind of, this book basically takes a look of all the types of content that we have in our that we have in our archive, including the happy stuff and the absolutely just horrific, just awful stuff. Apologies about that. It is partly deliberate. Part of our kind of mission is not just to kind of inspire our organizing efforts and learn from tactics and things of past struggles, but it's also a kind of broader mission to show the reality of capitalism and colonialism and and racism and sexism and fascism and Nazism and all types of oppression and exploitation, and just how dark our world often is, and also show why that is. So we do show some of that stuff, and especially a lot of people in former colonial powers or current colonial powers like the UK or US, a lot of people don't know a lot about their own country's history, their brutal history, either in colonies, in places like the UK or in the US, within the country itself. Taking a couple of examples, in the UK, a big part of national identity is people thinking, oh yeah, we fought the Nazis, we saved Jewish people from the concentration camps, blah, blah, blah. But most British people, hardly anyone knows that the Holocaust happening was not a single part of the justification for Britain entering World War II. Britain could not have cared less. At the same time, Britain was rounding up Jewish people and putting them in concentration camps during the war themselves, and deporting some Jewish people to other camps elsewhere in the empire, like Canada, Australia, and making them do forced labor and that sort of thing. And then straight after the war, the great democratic Britain again set up networks of concentration camps in colonies like Malaysia and Kenya, where Britain again threw hundreds of thousands of people into concentration camps, brutally murdered, tortured tens of thousands of people in every way, in the most disgusting and horrific ways imaginable. But it's not really part of our sense of, national identity and understanding. Like a lot of people, simply don't know about that sort of thing. So yeah, that sort of thing is partly deliberate. Also, I think it's partly a result of the sources which are available to us. So particularly violent or terrible events like massacres or things where people have died, they're more likely to have been reported at the time. There's more likely to be documentation like official reports, inquests, court cases, and just general paperwork about them, which historians can access. And I think a final thing, and this is something that we sort of struggle with, which I think is a difficult thing with storytelling, is that kind of almost any story with people's history, even the really great ones that are really great and inspiring, depending on how much of the story you tell, can end up being depressing in the end anyway.
That's so true.
There are lots of examples of places like the US auto factories. There was lots of amazing organization and really inspiring mass struggles, militant struggles that achieved big kind of improvements in conditions and work life and things like that, and really transformed a lot of workers' everyday lives. And that's obviously a good story, but then you can fast forward a bit further in the future, and then obviously the reaction to that is a lot of those plants were closed down and started up instead in other places where there were like military dictatorships in Brazil, where if people organized, it would be more easy to jail or kill them, and some of those plants got shut down. So yeah, it kind of depends on where you stop, when you stop telling the story.
Well, I mean, I think, in many ways, John, it speaks to the sort of cyclical nature of struggle, right? Angela Davis has that axiom that freedom is a constant struggle, right? And that, no matter how much we fight to break the forces of oppression and capital, there are insidious ways that they keep coming back. And I think in many ways, and I've talked about this before on Coffee with Comrades, in many ways, that's not the most despairing thing in the world. In many ways, it's a kind of a beautiful thing, because it means that we're always working towards greater and greater, degrees of emancipation and liberation, and that we're constantly becoming more and more and more free and rooting out more and more and more oppression. And it can seem bleak and it can seem nihilistic, but I see it as almost this sort of Sisyphean struggle, right? This sort of existential fight against the absurdity of hierarchy and of oppression. And in many ways, I think it speaks to the sort of indelible heart of humankind's struggle against oppressive forces that exist in the world, and our collective effort to try and get free. And I think that's in many ways a really cogent thing, and something that we shouldn't run away from, and something that we should wrestle with in a very real way, but also genuinely celebrate as something that is worthy of remarking upon. It's not something that we should hide from, that as soon as we reach the top of one mountain, there's another mountain beyond it, right? If freedom really is a constant struggle, if the horizon of our collective liberation is constantly receding into the distance, then that's not a bad thing. It's actually a really encouraging thing, because it's meaning that we're reaching ever greater heights of freedom and of voluntary association and of spontaneity and creativity, and it allows us to become more self-actualized than we were before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. And also I think an attitude that we come across a lot, say on our social media pages when we talk about something that happened in the past, is that people say, recently we posted something about a strike of banana workers in Colombia, where up to 2,000 strikers were massacred by the army, and other things like the Ludlow massacre in the US, where troops and militia machine gunned and murdered dozens of strikers. And people sort of comment things like, oh, nothing changes. And it's not that nothing changes. Obviously bad things still happen, but these struggles in the past, it's the things that happen today, they're not, I don't know how to say it, but they're not mirrors of the past. Mm-hmm. They're kind of echoes. And yeah, terrible things do happen, but because of the struggles and sacrifices people have made in the past, a lot of the kind of stuff that we highlight, things like the Ludlow massacre in the States, police do horrible things now, especially, in demonstrations, they do beat and violently injure people in demonstrations and shoot, especially in the recent Black Lives Matter protests. A large number of people have been permanently disabled and maimed by violent police actions, which is, really terrible. But things like mass machine gunning dozens of workers and their wives and children, that hasn't happened recently, because of these struggles that happened in the past. And in other countries, these, again, military massacres of hundreds or sometimes thousands of striking workers, that's not something which has happened more recently. Yes, bad things do happen, but because of the struggles that have happened in the past, it's not like authorities wouldn't want to do things like that. They'd happily come out and kill whoever if it made their lives easier, but they know that depending on where they are, they can't get away with that kind of behavior as they were able to in the past. And that isn't nothing. It's not worth nothing. That means something. It's important to acknowledge, how far we've got to go. But also, we do need to think about how far we have come, because some things are worse than ever now, but other things have got better.
Yeah.
And that is because of those struggles in the past.
No, I think that's well said. I think that, whether consciously or not, I think people often too literally interpret Marx's axiom that history repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. That's not a literal statement. Like these. I think the term you use of echoes, I think is a much better. A much more appropriate term for these kinds of patterns that we see emerge in history. And I think that, for better or worse, like human beings are especially equipped at pattern recognition, and sometimes it can feel really heavy to just see these patterns and recognize that like these same struggles are still playing out. But I think it really does depend on how we contextualize them, like you just said, and how we see them progressing forward. And to also recognize that history is not some linear thing that is always progressing, right? It is not a there is no moral arc of the universe, right? It is something that is much more dynamic and fluid and can change at the drop of a hat, and doesn't always get better. There are, in fact, as you put it, there are things that are much worse today than there were in decades and centuries past. But I do think that it's worthy of thinking critically about history as more than just some kind of static progression or some sort of nihilistic regression. It's much more dynamic and emergent than either of those kind of pictures. One of the things I kind of always wanted to ask y'all at Working Class History is if there's an appreciable difference between people's history, to use like Howard Zinn's term, and working class history, because I've heard you guys use those terms more or less interchangeably, and I was curious if there was something that distinguishes working class history from people's history, or if that's not, if they're just synonymous.
Howard Zinn and his work have been a huge influence on us, especially his work, People's History of the United States. We actually did think about calling ourselves People's History when we were sort of starting out. I think we're a bit torn on whether that would have been the best move or not. Mm-hmm. I think we probably maybe would have been more popular if we had, but we chose the name that we did for kind of political reasons, and I think they were kind of twofold. So on the one hand, we wanted to really be clear to get across the class nature of capitalism. Mm-hmm. That capitalism is dependent on the existence of a class of people who've been dispossessed of means of survival by ourselves. So land, factories, and all that we don't own, so we have to work for someone else for a living. That happened in the Western European countries by enclosures of common land, and then that was spread around the globe by colonialism. And that creates this class of people who are then forced to work for others. We don't have property that we can live off, so we are then forced to work for a wage for people who do own property. As workers, we are paid less than the value that we produce, and so that additional value that we create, the difference between the value we create and the wages that we're paid, that's how the wealthy make profits, and that's how they accumulate capital, and that's how they grow. That's how companies grow, that's how economies grow. That's with our life activity that's been taken from us. We are all kind of exploited by that system. We all therefore share a common interest in getting rid of that system which exploits all of us. So we thought that was really important to get across. And on the flip side of that, but by the type of content that we talk about and the type of stories we highlight, we really wanted to stress the interconnectedness or intersectionality of all other types of oppression and exploitation with class. And this is really something which needs to be challenged, because, just take a couple of examples on our social media pages, because we're called sort of Working Class History. It does seem to be happening less and less, which I think is a positive sign, but it still happens all the time that if we post something, say, about LGBT plus history, people, almost always some white bloke, they'll comment, "Oh, this is LGBT history, this isn't working class history," totally ignoring the fact that things like homophobia or transphobia, they're always going to be worse for working class and poor people than wealthy people. If you're so rich that you don't have to work for someone else for a living, then say employers being able to discriminate against LGBT people isn't a direct personal concern for you. That all those struggles are related, and say like similarly, when we post stuff about colonialism and indigenous struggles, sometimes again your kind of white socialist bloke is like, this is indigenous history, not working class history. While funnily enough, these are generally like lefty, socialisty people or whatever, or anarchist or whatever, and they say, and they'd always say like they're not racist or anything like that. But at the same time, no one ever says anything about that when we talk about enclosures, which was how people were dispossessed of the land. They don't say that's not related to working class history because that's obviously how the working class got created. Whereas colonialism overseas, the genocide of Native Americans was very much about the same thing, destroying common ownership, seizing land and resources, and then either forcing people to work for a wage or wiping them out. And clearly, they're all part of the same, it's part of the same story. Clearly, there's a deep interrelatedness there. Or if we post something about the suffragettes in the UK fighting for the right to vote, again, the guy comes on and says, "Oh, this isn't relevant for working class history because the suffragettes supported World War One." But most trade unions in Europe supported World War One as well. But they don't say that talking about unions at the same time isn't related to working class history because of that. So we thought it was really important to get across both of those things. In terms of whether there's a difference to people's history, I think we kind of use the terms pretty much interchangeably. One thing that might be a slight difference, a specific difference, although we never saw Howard Zinn do this, a number of other outlets, or whatever you want to call them, that talk about people's history sometimes do things like they may celebrate people from different oppressed groups who've achieved some sort of personal position of power within capitalist or existing power structures, like the first women politicians in a particular area or something like that. And that's not something that our project does, because for us, the key thing is conditions for the majority of working class people, not particular individuals who've managed to do well against all the odds. So an example of this, Margaret Thatcher becoming the first woman prime minister in the UK.
Thinking that is like people's history is repugnant to me. I was thinking you were gonna go with like something like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or something like that, but like, oh my god, like saying Margaret Thatcher is like a champion of people's history is making my skin crawl.
Exactly, because her being in that position didn't do anything to help other women, working class women in particular. Quite the opposite in many cases. For working class women in particular in places like mining communities, many of their lives were completely destroyed by Margaret Thatcher's conservative policies. That's an extreme example, but an example nonetheless. We look at this kind of question in some of the events in the book as well. So some of the examples we've got in the book look at this sort of question. So in 1977 in Atlanta, there was a strike of black sanitation workers in the city. They went on strike for a very modest pay increase. And the mayor was the first black mayor of Atlanta who'd been elected with widespread support from the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And he sacked all the sanitation workers in the city. And he did this with the support of civil rights leaders, people like Martin Luther King Sr., not Martin Luther King Jr., to be noted, who, of course, was previously assassinated while supporting a strike of black sanitation workers in Memphis. So some of the examples in the book kind of look at this question of representation within capitalist and colonialist power structures. And if that necessarily translates to material improvements for working class people.
Right. Well, I mean, it's really cool thinking about how, you would think that ostensibly something like a working class history would, shy away from a sort of intersectional look at different sorts of oppressions. And so it's Obviously anyone who's followed working class history knows that that's not the case, but it's interesting that part of the thought process that went into choosing that name was intentionally trying to highlight the class connections that these intersectional oppressions highlight and demarcate amongst various types of identities and various types of oppression.
I think we can't underestimate how important this question is, because another thing that we try to challenge, and there are examples that look in this, is the book, is the times when white working class people have undermined their own class unity by siding with their racial identity as opposed to their class identity.
Right.
And how that's been disastrous for the working class movement in different places. And that's a really important thing to challenge. And it's something which continually rears its head on the left, when wannabe populists on the left start in the UK talking about slogans like British jobs for British workers. So in the US, there's obviously similar things with people talking about America first, and even, figures on the left talking about the threat that migrant workers pose to American workers in quotation marks and their conditions, which is a completely upside down way of looking at what is happening and is extremely dangerous. Not just because it's morally repugnant, completely counterproductive for working class people. And it just encourages us to fight amongst ourselves instead of organizing together against those who are really exploiting and screwing us over. Yeah, so we try and highlight examples where that has occurred and how completely disastrous that has been.
That's awesome. Well, before we part ways, John, I did want to ask you real quick, did your favorite bit of working class history end up in the pages of the book?
There's so many little snippets of radical history bouncing around in my brain that I can't really identify any particular favorites, because I can't keep track of them all at one time. But certainly there are some things that I really love in there, obviously. And so I guess one example would be, I don't know about you, but I really hate Nazis. I fucking hate Nazis.
I don't think that's a controversial opinion. I'm sorry if this is controversial,
but it might not be PC to say that in these times with these snowflakes and everything. But I don't care. I fucking hate Nazis, and there's some good stories about Nazis getting fucked over. And I think one of my favorites is one from North Carolina in 1958, where the Ku Klux Klan were very unhappy with a group of Native Americans called the Lumbee. And they were in particular very unhappy with Lumbee women having sexual relationships with white men. So they started trying to organize to stop this horrific race mixing and everything. And they started trying to intimidate Lumbee women by doing things like cross burnings. And then they called for a mass rally, which they said would end race mixing once and for all. And they declared that thousands of Klansmen would be there. And in the end, not that many of them actually showed up, but 500 Lumbee people did show up, led by World War II veterans, armed with shotguns and shovels and picks. They attacked the Nazis, opened fire on them. The Klan tried to kind of shoot back, but they didn't hit anyone, and they were forced to flee in abject defeat, and had their Klan flags and banners all nicked off them, and they had to kind of flee off into the night with their tail between their legs. And the Lumbee anti-Klan protesters then just had a bit of a celebration, and that became an annual celebration every year after that, celebrating the rout of the Klan. That's a particular favorite bit of mine. But also there's a lot of cool stuff that we weren't able to fit in. So hopefully, we can put it in a future book. I suppose one fun little thing that we put something in touching on it, but we're not able to go into that much detail, is something that I've been kind of reading and thinking quite a lot about recently, is struggles over tea breaks at work. And tea breaks are at work, because especially in the UK, it's a stereotype about British people drinking tea. But it's also true. I'm British, for anyone who doesn't know accents. A lot of people in the US think I'm Australian or whatever, but I'm not. Yeah, I personally fucking hate tea. But
Tell me how you really feel, John.
A lot of Brits do love their tea. And British workers having tea breaks was something which was won after many years of struggles. And there were strikes over it, and people would sort of stop work and drink their tea. There's some really funny kind of examples of how people, business owners from other countries would come, and then they'd encounter that and just think, what the hell is going on? I like one example I always think is really funny is George Lucas doing the Star Wars movies, which was shot in the UK, and he couldn't believe the fact that they're shooting Star Wars. They're in the middle of a scene. Harrison Ford is, doing this, that, and the other, but it doesn't matter if it's mid shot or whatever. At whenever time it was, I think 11 around 11 a.m. and then in the mid afternoon, the crew just puts down their stuff and goes and has their tea. Regardless of what's happening, it's tea break time. So it's like, that's it.
That's awesome.
Stuff down. Harrison Ford can just sit there and wait, and they'll have their tea, and then they'll come back and resume afterwards. And then when it's the end of the day, that's it. Boom, and they're gone. And and people like George Lucas would obviously just have to put up with that. And then obviously there was so that was in the 70s, and then part of the kind of capitalist and counteroffensive after the kind of 70s was a real concerted attack on things like tea breaks. And then there were lots of struggles of people trying to defend where employers were trying to take the tea breaks away, and then workers would try and defend them either by going on strike or by like deliberately taking the tea breaks against policy and making them really long and stuff like that. So yeah, there's like mention of tea breaks in there, but but that's also a personal favorite kind of aspect of things, because again, it's a really small, just stopping work to have a tea or a coffee or whatever is just a really sort of normal thing, especially depending on the type of work that you do. It's I've mostly done like office jobs or whatever, which have particular privileges like that, ability to most of the time to do things like that when relatively freely, which you don't get if you're working in like an Amazon warehouse or if you're working outside. But I think it's just fun seeing all these little things, that there's history and there's struggle in these tiny little aspects of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that tea and coffee breaks are absolutely something we can support here on Coffee with Comrades. So, John, thank you so much for this lovely conversation, my friend. I'm really glad that we could sit down and pick your brain. Thanks for reaching out, and I'm glad we could collaborate and have this conversation about the book. Before we part ways, could you let listeners know where they can go to pick up a copy of Working Class History, Everyday Acts of Resistance and Rebellion? And can you also let folks know where they can go to support Working Class History's educational efforts online?
Yeah, just to say again, thanks so much for having me. And, it's great to be working together and on your podcast, which is great. So it's great that you're doing it and providing this space for these type of conversations. And I know it's a lot of work, just even though it's just sort of chatting and then putting the audio out. I know how much work goes into that. So it's really impressive, especially being weekly is absolutely incredible. Our podcast isn't close to that. So that is a real testament to the amount of dedication and everything. It's been great. And yeah, if you want to get the book, it's in our online store at shop.workingclasshistory.com. You can also check out our podcast. It's called Working Class History. Probably wherever you're listening to this one, it'll be on that, or on our website, workingclasshistory.com. And we've got a Patreon at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. If you want little daily reminders of people's history in your face through your phone or whatever, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr. We haven't got a Snapchat yet. I don't think we'll be doing a Snapchat, so don't hold your breath for that. But you can check all those out. I think that's it.
Fuck yeah. Awesome. Well, seriously, thanks again. This has been super fun. Solidarity, my friend.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry if I've rambled on a bit too much.
No, not at all. That's the glory of these conversations, is that the rambling is usually the best parts.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
So that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and if that made you want to check out our book, which we hope it did, just a reminder that it is available in our online store at shop.workingclasshistory.com, link in the show notes. As you're listening to this, you can also get 10% off your next order from the store with our discount code, WCH Podcast. In terms of the book right now, there are still copies available from our first print run. Paperback copies are available in the US, but they've nearly sold out internationally, but you can still get one of the last copies available. Hardback copies have now sold out in the US, but you can pre-order one and get it sent out as soon as the new print run is done. And as we're putting this podcast together, there are still a couple of hardback copies left outside the US which you can still get. There are also all major ebook formats available if you prefer those. This episode was edited by Coffee with Comrades, so again, do check them out and subscribe, link in the show notes. It was then lightly edited by us. Thanks as always to our Patreon supporters who make our work possible. Special thanks to Conor Canatsey and Ariel Gioia. If you can, please consider supporting our work on Patreon, where depending on your level, you get access to exclusive bonus episodes, get early access to podcast episodes, and get free stuff like the WCH book, posters, stickers and the like. If you can't, absolutely no worries. Please just take a minute to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Our theme music is Italian partisan anthem Bella Ciao, courtesy of Dischi del Sole. Links to buy and stream it in the show notes. Thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morire. E se muoio da partigiano, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E se muoio da partigiano, tu mi devi seppellire lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Seppellire lassù in montagna, sotto l'ombra di un bel fior. E le genti che passeranno, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. E le genti che passeranno mi diranno che bel fior. E questo è il fiore del partigiano.